Hey guys, welcome back. I'm City Walk City Wall, and you're watching another episode in Kobayashi Island. This episode, the first thing I'm going to work on is putting this giant industrial steel factory here on the very outskirts of the city. I know I said for a few episodes in a row now that we were planning on going back to the harbor and finishing that out this episode, but as I was going through what unique factories I have left to build, this one kind of stood out to me because I don't think it would really fit the style of the harbor. And last episode I talked about how I felt like this whole farmland area might have had some more of these sort of older industrial buildings in the past that got torn down in recent years. And last episode I built one of those factories that was still left over from that time. So I thought this industrial steel plant sort of went along with that idea and could work in this area, even though it's pretty huge and old looking. The main thing that I did to add some detail to this factory was work with the parking lot roads to make sort of a rim road around the whole edge of it and some parking areas also around the factory. I also added in some crop processing buildings inside the factory. I think they're milking parlors maybe around the back so that trucks would drive through these parking lot roads, and also so there'd just be a little bit more crop processing in this area. I also put in a metal warehouse here sort of inside of the factory because this factory only uses metal. It's the one resource that it needs. And one of the things I was noticing about these unique factories, which I'll eventually have to deal with, is all of my warehouses are currently maxed out with the number of trucks that they're using. So I'm seeing an issue where some of these unique factories can't get goods delivered in time, even though I have the goods that they need. So I think that's another thing I'll have to work on in the harbor area when I get back over to that. I'm starting to get a little worried that this harbor isn't actually big enough for all the unique factories that I have planned and all of these warehouses. But I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get there. We may need to expand the harbor further out from where it is now, or put a lot of this stuff into the airport area. We'll see. This factory, I really do like the way that it looks, how it kind of looks like an old building, like I was saying before. And there's this really awesome model that I saw Ronix 69 released recently that I really wanted to use here in combination with this building and kind of clip them together. It's like a blast furnace building, and it's actually, he says it's based off of a building in Tokyo in the harbor there, and it's a really interesting area. And I had always been looking at that area and thinking that I wanted to do something like that in Kobayashi Island. But just looking at that model that he made, it has almost 100,000 tries, which is probably 3 or 4 times more than your average like big skyscraper, and maybe 50 or 100 times more than just a regular building. And I couldn't really justify it to myself, putting down something that would take up that much of the kind of bandwidth of the game. So that was a cool idea, and I would have liked to do that, but I'm pretty happy with the way that this turned out. So the next thing I focused on this episode, as you can see right now, is this train station. It's a 4-platform train station, and what's going to go sort of on the far side of the train station towards the water, away from the farmland. I mentioned last episode that there's going to be towns around each of these rural train stations, and last episode I made a really small town around the station that's sort of in the heart of the farmland. But this episode I was thinking that this town would be a good amount bigger, with some like 6 or 8 story buildings and high school and an elementary school and apartments and commercial buildings. And in my mind, I'm imagining that the density of the city sort of stretches along the water all the way to this area, because it's like the ocean side and people might prefer to live by the water, even if that means slightly longer commute to work in downtown. So I think this area that's left to build here along the water is going to be slightly dense, like no farms or anything, and definitely a good amount of tightly packed residential buildings. I'm sort of imagining that maybe this was a town that was an independent town from the rest of Kobayashi Island at some point in the past. Like it would have taken, a day's horseback ride or whatever to get from here to downtown or something, way back in the day. But, now it's obviously become part of the city of Kobayashi Island. The two have sort of merged, and this train line can get you there relatively quickly. So that's sort of the history of this place I'm imagining a little bit. This train station, like I said, is one of the largest ones I have. It's 4 platforms instead of 2. So what happens here is multiple lines come into the stop from the downtown and then split up here, where one of them goes up the hill to the mining town and then further along to the harbor. And the other one splits off and heads down to the water, and it's probably going to dead end at one more stop over there at this sort of like beach town area. You can see I downloaded a few more train assets recently, some of these more older looking trains, mainly because I didn't want the newer looking JR trains to be the one that goes up to the mining town. I thought that would be a little bit weird seeing kind of newer trains up there. So I think this train station will eventually look pretty cool with all the different types of trains that are stopping here, and the old ones that go up to the mountain and the new ones that go down to the beach. So I mentioned it before, but Kobayashi Island is really lacking in education, especially high schools. So you just saw me put one down now. I wanted to make sure this area had a high school, since the high school asset I have subscribed to is really big and not very tall, and it's pretty difficult to fit it into the downtown because of its size and shape. Probably should subscribe to some other ones, but this is the only one I have at the moment. What I wanted to do was pay a little homage to one of the schools I went to when I was growing up. That was like this really big blocky building up on this hill overlooking the water and had a really good view of some local landmarks. I remember being in class and being able to look out the window and just have this beautiful view of the ocean and the city. And so I thought it'd be fun to give the students of Kobayashi Island a little bit of a similar experience here. I did that same cheat that I've done with the industrial buildings, where I copied 2 or 3 of these high schools on top of each other in the same place, so that instead of 1,000 people who go here, 3,000 people can go here, which has really made this town a destination for people all over the city, because that alone is probably about half of the city's entire high school capacity. I also put down a couple of these elementary schools along the train tracks here and kind of detailed them up with some trees and stuff. And what you're about to see me start doing is start to work on this process of building these residential neighborhoods. My strategy with this, because it's so painstaking to make these low density residential neighborhoods just because of the amount of buildings, is basically just going through and placing down a big chunk of houses all at once, a few blocks worth, just so that I don't have to keep opening and closing this RICO window. As you can see right now, this RICO window at the time of the recording is completely glitched out, where there's only one row of it, so it takes a really long time to scroll from where it opens up on the far left to the far right, where all the buildings that I use are. And so I didn't really want to have to keep opening and closing this window, and so I was just like, I'm just going to place all these buildings down at once. I'm not going to open and close this window a million times and spend forever scrolling. And since doing this, I actually realized that the Resize It mod completely fixes this problem. I recently got that and realized I was an idiot for doing it the way that I did here, where I just was stuck scrolling forever. But this Resize It mod's amazing. Not only does it make it so that the RICO window uses the full space of the toolbar there, but it also adds photos that wouldn't have been there before, little icons for some of these buildings and stuff, which is really great. I really was really a lifesaver getting that mod. Wish I had it at the time of this. So then after I put down all the buildings, next thing I did was kind of go through with the surface painting assets and make sure that there's concrete between the streets and the houses, and then fill in the area between the houses with shrubs and trees, and finally put some parked cars throughout, kind of on people's driveways. After I did this big chunk of houses, I really surprised myself with how quickly I was able to get that done compared to neighborhoods in the past where I built people's backyards individually and detailed them with, props and benches and tables and fountains and things. And even though doing it this way is slightly less detailed, it's a little bit more sloppy and quick, I think overall, especially from a distance, it looks pretty much just as good because what you're seeing is just a bunch of houses with trees around them. So I'm not completely mad at it. It did take a lot less time, and doing low residential stuff is kind of some of the more difficult things in the game for me in terms of just keeping my attention. It's very boring if you ask me. So just being able to do it faster was really, really helpful in order to get just this style of building done. So after this neighborhood, what I decided to do for the rest of the episode, since I did figure out a good way to do it, was to continue working in this low residential stuff and kind of bridge the gap between Old Town and this area so that the city sort of continuously stretches all the way from the Old Town to here, and it's not just like an island of houses in a little town that I built here. Something interesting that I did here, you just saw me place down this road and this triangle of fences and some shrubs and trees in between. That little corner there did not need to be a park, didn't need to have a triangle road there, but I think I just sort of saw an opportunity to do something cool and interesting there, where there's just like a little bit of trees and like a fence around it that breaks up this area. I think that's like kind of a normal thing in a lot of neighborhoods where there's just like a little area where it's like grassy and there's no houses there. It's not wall-to-wall houses everywhere you go. There's just like a couple little spots that break it up, and maybe are public places, or maybe are sort of just like green areas that are fenced off and unused, but just something where like the raccoons or whatever could live. So I like that. It's also very similar to, I did something similar a couple episodes ago, maybe more than a couple episodes ago, but in the Leaving the City episode, where there's like a triangle shaped park in between some trees. So there might be a few other times where that kind of becomes like a little bit of a style of the residential neighborhoods in Kobayashi Island, where there's kind of triangle shaped parks or just green areas in the city. Like I said before, the next thing I'm going to work on here is this area between Old Town and what I've been working on so far this episode. So you saw me build the road networks for this and this awesome little bridge that goes over this other road, the one that connects from here to the residential neighborhood I mentioned a second ago, the one from the Leaving the City episode. I really like the way that that bridge looks and the road that goes under it. I used these train track stone pillars that kind of give the bridge sort of an older look, a little bit less vanilla looking, and I think in combination with the rail bridge that's directly next to that, pretty cool little ravine that I end up detailing here in a bit with some rocks and trees and whatnot. This residential area, you can see I'm building it in the same way where I'm placing down all the houses first. And in this area, I'm trying to make an effort to use some more of the traditional Japanese looking houses, the larger ones with curved roofs, so that it kind of bridges the gap from Old Town, where it's almost entirely those kinds of houses, to this new town where it's a mix of old and new houses more. This whole area I was planning on doing, not anytime near now. I think I was planning on doing it towards the end of building this entire Kobayashi Island. But, once I realized sort of how quickly these residential neighborhoods could get built in this way, I decided it was probably just a good idea to go and finish this out so that the area next to Old Town was finished, and there wasn't just sort of like an island town sitting in the middle of a bunch of unfinished land, and just kind of do that before moving on. So what I'm planning on doing next, I know I've said this for like 4 episodes in a row now, but I promise it's finally going to happen, is I'm going to go back to the harbor and I'm going to finish that out. I have just a couple more unique industrial buildings left, so that's what's going to happen, is placing down those and placing down a bunch of warehouses and seeing how the traffic in the harbor works as a whole, trying to fix any issues I still might have, and it's just really seeing how those unique factories impact the city and how much goods they're going to be able to produce. Because, I was noticing a thing that may affect, which of the unique factories I place down. Some of the factories are really massive, but don't actually produce many goods. Like, their output is much lower than the output of some of the smaller factories. Like, for instance, the lemonade factory, it's one of the larger ones, but it produces only like 1/3 of the amount of goods as the shipyard, even though the shipyard is like half its size. So I don't think I'm going to have room for every single factory that's available in the harbor. I think I'll probably skip a few of those less efficient ones, like the lemonade factory, and may end up using that cheat again with these factories where I duplicate up a few of them in the same place to increase their output, or have a couple of them next to each other. I mean, even now I'm starting to see a lot of trucks from the factories that I do have, particularly the ones here, the toy factory and the industrial steel factory in this area. And the trucks are leaving the factory and delivering goods to commercial buildings nearby, but it's not enough. Like, you can see, every once in a while a truck goes by and delivers goods to those places, but if I had a highway that was connected from Kobayashi Island to the edge of the map, it would just be so many more trucks driving around this area. It would be so much more bustling, and that's sort of one of the problems I've had with Kobayashi Island, at least. I mean, it's both a visual problem and a functionality problem, that there's not really enough cars, and I would love to see more cars in Kobayashi Island. It's kind of a bummer that the city looks so empty, especially at the beginning, and I would just love for there to be some traffic and really see these trucks going around. And that also means that there's not enough trucks delivering goods, so there's not all the commercial buildings are complaining, and the city's not really functioning how it should. So hopefully the harbor, unique factories, the airport, things like that will slowly over time try and eventually fix that issue. Really hoping, because it would be great to have some traffic in Kobayashi Island and really see the city functioning as well as it possibly can. So after that neighborhood up on the hill that you were just watching me make, the next thing I do is go back and detail up this high school and the area around it. With buildings like this, where it has some props built into it, I generally think it's a good idea to try and play up those details that it has, as opposed to trying to cover them up or hide them. So for instance, this high school has these flagpoles, so what I decided to do, rather than cover them up with a building or something, is I built sort of like a lunch area out here with these kind of grassy curbs and some benches and trees, and I placed down a couple additional flags there to kind of make it sort of like a, I don't know, flag area, or I don't know exactly, but kind of just play up that detail that it already had. I mean, not always. Sometimes I do hide the details, but if it's there, maybe there's a reason that it's there, and it's a good jumping off point to build a little story around an area sometimes, as opposed to being 100% creative in your own way. So next to this restaurant, next to this high school, I put down a little restaurant, and the restaurant has a little parking lot, and I think this whole street that goes from the high school to the center of Old Town is going to be pretty commercial with a lot of shops. I remember I said in episode 2 or 3 of the series, right at the beginning, that these roads that lead out of the Old Town are really important because they're probably the oldest roads in the city. So I think it's the kind of thing where sort of one shop after another just continued to open up further and further along this road until eventually it was just straight shops from the Old Town to the New Town. So kind of, bridge the gap between the two of them. By the way, I probably need to figure out a name for this town. I mean, I probably should have done that before I started this episode, so I wasn't just trying to describe this place and just struggle and be calling it the New Town or whatever, this New Town. So if you have any name suggestions for this place, or really suggestions for anywhere in the city, let me know. I mean, everything is pretty generic, just, right now. I've been calling things like the fish market or the farmland rather than making up actual names for them, because I'm not particularly good at making up names. I mean, maybe some of you are. So if making up names for things is sort of something you're good at, please hit me up and give me some suggestions. You can hit me up on the comments here, or Instagram or Discord. It's all listed in the description below. I think it would be really fun at some point to go through and rename the places in the city. The last thing that I wanted to talk about this episode, you just saw me do it, and I think it turned out really awesome, is I made these decks for the houses that are overlooking the little Old Town harbor here. What I did was I placed down a ploppable surface, and I sort of have it overhanging out over the cliff, and then there are these awesome wooden pillars. I'm pretty sure they're vanilla, and they come up if you search wood in the Find It mod. They're really awesome for this kind of stuff. I've used them in other places in the city as wooden supports, so I use them here sort of like under this first deck, kind of like hold up the ploppable surface. And I put some fences around the edge so people don't fall off, and just copied that base deck of just the flat part, the supports, and the fences to a few other areas around, and kind of then went on to detail them up, variations of it, with different benches and different tables and things. But sort of that base I just copied around, and I really like the way that it looks, so I made a second variation of the deck with some Ronix 6.9 expressway pillars, just sort of like concrete with the ploppable surface on top, and some fence around that as well. And really like the way that this turned out. I think this is kind of an iconic looking thing, these decks, and I may end up copying this base deck into other residential areas that I build as well, because it's a very interesting way of doing things, I think, and kind of gives like a sense of realism that you wouldn't normally have. Having like people with big decks isn't something that is part of the base game, obviously, so I think it's pretty cool. That's about it for this episode. Next episode, we'll go to the harbor, finish that out all over there, and let me know what you thought of the city tour last week, if I should do more of those or if I should incorporate smaller ones into the episodes. Really love your feedback. Anyways, that's it. Hope you have a nice rest of your day. I'm City Walk, City Wall. You've been watching Kobayashi Island, and I'll see you all next time.